Poorer than you think. France's silent economic decline. The Eiffel Tower still sparkles, but the lights are dimming on one of Europe's founding economies. Beneath the veneer of Parisian chic, France is grappling with a hidden crisis, a shocking decline in real wealth and competitiveness that could destabilize the entire Eurozone. Are you prepared for the true cost of France's silent slide? The mirage of prosperity. The French paradox. A nation synonymous with luxury, high culture, and a $3 trillion economic engine. But beneath the glittering veneer of the Champs-Élysées, a quiet economic erosion is taking place. This is the story of how France became fundamentally poorer than its peers, masked by institutional debt and the shimmering success of a select few corporations. This is the silent slide they don't want you to see, and it threatens the stability of the entire Eurozone. For years, headline GDP growth numbers have been used to paint a picture of resilience. But the truth is found in a far more critical metric: real GDP per capita. Unlike nominal GDP, this figure adjusts for inflation and population, telling us the actual wealth and purchasing power of the average French citizen. Experts at institutions like the OECD have shown that since the global financial crisis in 2008, France's real GDP per capita has seen near zero growth, flatlining while the US and Germany, even with their own struggles, manage significant upward movement. This is not a failure of recession, but a failure of prosperity. The growth they do report is often temporary, fueled by an expansive public sector pumping out stimulus and services. This is growth bought with future debt, not generated by private sector vitality or enhanced productivity. The average French worker is producing less value per hour, and the nation as a whole is running on fumes, disguising a fundamental lack of economic dynamism. The industrial core rot. The foundation of any major economy is its industrial base. For France, this foundation has been slowly dissolving. In the 1,980 seconds, manufacturing contributed approximately $20% of France's GDP. Today, that figure hovers at just over $10%. This massive deindustrialization was not sudden. It was a decades-long process fueled by specific structural policy choices, the implementation of the 35-hour workweek, and persistently high non-wage labor costs that made French factories more expensive to run than their neighbors. The result? A steady exodus of manufacturing jobs and production capacity to lower-cost regions. To understand the severity of this, we must look across the Rhine. The core of the Eurozone's economic design was supposed to be a convergence of competitiveness. Instead, we got divergence. Post-Euro adoption, Germany implemented the painful, but ultimately effective, Hartz reforms, aggressively cutting unit labor costs and making German exports hyper-competitive. France failed to make such decisive changes. High social charges, rigid labor laws, and strong union power meant French unit labor costs remained stubbornly high. This cripples export potential, makes goods expensive globally, and acts as a massive deterrent for foreign direct investment, FDI, into the manufacturing sector, locking France into a productivity trap. The only reason France's trade deficit isn't a catastrophic chasm is the exceptional success of its global luxury conglomerates, the so-called LVMH effect. Brands like Hermès, L'Oréal, and the aforementioned LVMH command massive margins, generating immense export revenue, and masking the deep industrial deficit. Analysts show that the top 10 export companies are responsible for an utterly disproportionate share of the nation's trade surplus. This success story is a dangerous exception. It hides the failure of the hundreds of thousands of medium and small enterprises that make up the backbone of a healthy economy, giving policymakers a false sense of security while the broader industrial base crumbles. The fiscal time bomb. The defining feature of the French economy is the sheer size of its state. Public spending in France is a staggering commitment, often clocking in at $55 dollar to $60 dollar of GDP, consistently the highest in the Eurozone, dwarfing figures in Germany and the UK. This massive fiscal footprint, while funding excellent healthcare and social security, acts as a profound economic drag. By committing such a high percentage of national output to public services and redistribution, the state effectively crowds out private investment, forcing high taxation on corporations and individuals, which suppresses risk-taking, entrepreneurship, and job creation, a persistent fiscal drag on growth. The official figure for public debt, currently around $112% dollar of GDP, is concerning enough. But the true fear factor for financial markets lies in the hidden debt and contingent liabilities. This includes the implicit, unfunded liabilities of the massive national pension system, and the growing debt held by state agencies like CAIDS, which manages Social Security debt. When experts calculate France's total liabilities, including future commitments and unfunded mandates, the figure skyrockets, placing its debt burden in a far more precarious category than official figures suggest. Furthermore, the high reliance on debt means a disproportionate amount of state resources must be dedicated to interest payments, creating a dangerous vulnerability to future interest rate hikes. This precarious fiscal position has put France squarely in the crosshairs of the major rating agencies. The risk of a sovereign rating downgrade from S&P, Moody's, or Fitch is not just an abstract financial event, it's a statement of diminished national credibility. A downgrade increases the cost of borrowing, making it even harder for the state to fund its extensive spending. Critically, if France struggles to service its debt or faces a crisis of confidence, the entire Franco-German engine that drives the European Union falters. France is not merely another weak link, it is a foundational pillar. Its collapse would precipitate a crisis far larger and more complex than the Greek or Italian crises, potentially shattering the political and financial architecture of the Eurozone itself. Geopolitics and energy vulnerability. France has long enjoyed a perceived energy advantage through its massive nuclear fleet, EDF. However, the war in Ukraine and the resulting energy crisis exposed a critical hidden vulnerability. Decades of underinvestment and deferred maintenance. In 2022, a shocking percentage of EDF's reactors were offline for checks and repairs, forcing France, a supposed energy exporter, to buy expensive spot market power. Compounding this, the state-mandated ARENH mechanism forced EDF to sell cheap power to competitors, effectively gutting the national champion's balance sheet. The nuclear promise is now a nuclear liability, increasing industrial energy costs and adding significant uncertainty to the economy. Beyond Europe, France's global supply chain exposure presents a rising geopolitical risk. Its major industries, from Airbus to automotive and high-tech, rely heavily on Chinese manufacturing and, critically, on China's near monopoly of rare earth minerals. In a world rapidly moving toward de-risking or partial economic decoupling, a trade war or sudden geopolitical fissure would hit France's export-heavy economy hard. The strategic necessity of maintaining access to these markets contrasts sharply with the growing security concerns, placing France on an uncomfortable and financially exposed geopolitical tightrope. Finally, France's traditional sphere of influence in Africa, particularly the Sahel region, is eroding rapidly. The recent coups d'états in nations like Mali and Niger have seen a significant loss of French diplomatic and security influence. This isn't just a military concern. This loss of soft power and economic leverage impacts French strategic interests, access to critical resources, and the long-term stability of the CFA franc monetary zone, a key French financial mechanism. The geopolitical recession abroad mirrors the economic recession at home. The path forward. President Emmanuel Macron came to power on a platform of structural reform. His successes, like reforming some elements of the rigid labor code and cutting corporate taxes, have been steps in the right direction. However, they have been too incremental and met with fierce political and social resistance, gilets jaunes, pension protests, to reverse decades of decline. The French political system seems incapable of delivering the necessary, deep, and painful cuts to public spending and labor costs required to truly reset the country's economic trajectory. It's a Sisyphean task, where every gain is met with massive, costly resistance. For global investors, France is not a blanket short. The money continues to flow into a select few, globally competitive niches. The luxury, aviation, and defense sectors remain world-class, export-oriented, and largely insulated from domestic economic woes. These are the defensive stocks, the crème de la crème. Conversely, investors are becoming increasingly wary of domestically focused sectors, local banking reliant on French sovereign stability, and any industry heavily reliant on continuous, debt-funded public contracts. The investment thesis is to invest around the French economy, not in it. The greatest fear is that France's structural failures will metastasize into a European crisis. As high debt meets rising interest rates, French borrowing costs will inevitably diverge from Germany's. This is the moment the EU's fragile stability pact is tested. If France requires a bailout or political relief, the prospect of which is not impossible, it would trigger a constitutional crisis, pitting member state against member state. France, the founding member, is now a potential threat to the cohesion of the entire European project. Conclusion and call to action. The silent economic decline of France is not just an internal French problem. It is the Eurozone's ticking time bomb. The erosion of competitiveness, the addiction to debt, and the geopolitical vulnerabilities are combining to create a precarious situation. The true French Revolution required now is a financial and industrial one, a radical commitment to productivity over spending. Without it, the world's perception of France will finally align with the painful, stagnant reality. If the world's fifth largest economy is secretly struggling, what does that mean for your investments and your future? We've looked at France, but this phenomenon of hidden decline isn't unique. Next week, we'll dive into why Germany's energy strategy is a geopolitical disaster and how it will impact the global auto industry. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next hidden truth. The final conclusion of our analysis asserts that France's quiet economic decline is not merely a domestic fiscal challenge, but a structural crisis with profound implications for the stability of the Eurozone and the geopolitical balance of the West. To expand this section into a rigorous 5,000-word analysis, we must delve deeper into the strategic, financial, and political ramifications of this slow-motion collapse, examining the interacting variables that render this silent slide far more dangerous than an abrupt, visible crash. The anatomy of silent erosion, debt, competitiveness, and the social model. The core danger of France's situation lies in the insidious nature of its decline. It is not characterized by the sharp market panic seen in Greece or the chronic underperformance of Italy, but by a structural stagnation masked by sovereign size and institutional legacy. This state of affairs is the result of three compounding failures. Firstly, the sustained and critical decline in industrial competitiveness is the most tangible evidence of structural malaise. Decades of policy choices, most notably the high level of non-wage labor costs necessary to fund France's extensive social model, have rendered French production uncompetitive compared to its German and even Southern European peers. Analysis of unit labor costs, ULC, reveals a persistent and detrimental divergence. While Germany underwent the painful but effective Hartz reforms to lower its ULC and boost exports after the euro's adoption, France failed to institute similar, aggressive structural adjustments. This isn't just a marginal difference, it's a systemic barrier that starves the private sector of profitability, drives manufacturing capacity abroad, and limits job creation in high-value sectors. The survival of French manufacturing appears almost exclusively tied to a few state-backed strategic sectors and the luxury segment, which, while globally dominant, cannot sustainably carry the weight of the entire industrial economy. Secondly, the French debt crisis is a crisis of quality, not just quantity. The official debt-to-GDP ratio, hovering above 110%, is only the tip of the iceberg. The true vulnerability lies in the vast, unquantified implicit debt stemming from the generous and often unfunded national pension system and a multitude of social liabilities managed by off-budget entities. When financial institutions and rating agencies analyze the comprehensive debt burden, including these contingent and implicit liabilities, France's fiscal position ranks among the most precarious in the developed world. This reliance on expansive, credit-fueled public spending, which consumes up to $60% of GDP, effectively crowds out private investment and necessitates higher, growth-inhibiting taxation, creating a toxic feedback loop of fiscal dependency and structural stagnation. This is not simply deficit spending, it is foundational debt designed to maintain a social model that the underlying economy can no longer afford. Finally, the illusion of resilience is the ultimate structural failure. Economic policy has successfully deployed public spending to smooth over the rough edges of recessions and maintain headline GDP figures, giving the impression of stability. However, the stagnation in real GDP per capita proves that this growth is non-productive, failing to translate into tangible increases in the wealth or purchasing power of the average French citizen. This disconnect fuels deep-seated social frustration. manifesting in cyclical waves of protest against even minor, necessary reforms. The political system, caught between the demands of the global market and the entrenched expectations of the domestic social contract, finds itself paralyzed, unable to enact the necessary drastic measures to recalibrate the economy. Strategic implications for the Eurozone and European cohesion. The stability of the Eurozone is predicated on the operational health of its anchor states, particularly the Franco-German axis. France's economic erosion directly undermines this foundation, raising the specter of a systemic crisis far exceeding the scope of the 2010 to 2012 periphery debt crisis. The weakening of France fundamentally fractures the Franco-German engine. Germany, the economic powerhouse with its fiscal discipline, has traditionally provided the economic ballast, while France has provided the political vision, military heft, and strategic guidance for the bloc. A financially weakened France loses its political leverage. It cannot credibly drive ambitious, debt-requiring European projects, whether in defense, technology, or energy transition, if its own fiscal house is built on quicksand. This creates a dangerous strategic vacuum in the EU, compromising its ability to act decisively as a unified global player in an era of heightened geopolitical competition between the US and China. The threat of financial contagion from French sovereign debt is paramount. Given the sheer size of France's debt load, any loss of market confidence in French obligations assimilables du Trésor, OATs, would dwarf the impact of previous crises in the Eurozone periphery. European commercial banks, particularly those in Germany and the Netherlands, hold substantial French debt. A sharp sell-off, or a sudden, dramatic spike in OAT, yields a divergence from German bunds would immediately trigger a systemic banking crisis across the continent. This vulnerability is exacerbated by the fact that France's structural debt is less volatile but more pervasive than that of Southern Europe, rendering the risk more deeply entrenched within the core financial infrastructure of the EU. Moreover, France's fiscal behavior poses an existential threat to the Eurozone's constitutional integrity. France consistently violates the core fiscal rules enshrined in the Stability and Growth Pact, which mandates deficit control and debt reduction. Should the European Commission, or the more fiscally conservative member states, attempt to strictly enforce these rules, it would precipitate an unprecedented political confrontation. Forcing austerity on a core founder and nuclear power like France could lead to a constitutional crisis, determining whether the Eurozone is a union of law or a union subject to the political discretion of its largest members. Should France receive special exemption, the entire legal framework underpinning the euro would be invalidated, setting a disastrous precedent for all future fiscal discipline. Geopolitical fragility and the erosion of economic sovereignty. France's economic struggles translate directly into a loss of geopolitical influence and an increase in economic vulnerability on the global stage, directly contradicting its goal of European strategic autonomy. The crisis within the French nuclear sector, historically its greatest strategic asset, is a prime example. Decades of underinvestment and the structural and political pressures on EDF, Électricité de France, have led to widespread reactor closures and maintenance backlogs. This forced France, traditionally a net power exporter, to become a net importer during critical periods, exposing French industry and citizens to volatile global energy markets. The inability to guarantee cheap, stable, nuclear-generated power undercuts the competitiveness of every French business and casts doubt on the viability of massive, new nuclear investment plans. Energy sovereignty, the foundation of industrial strength, is compromised. Furthermore, France's position on the global stage is complicated by increasing strategic dependence. Its major industries, from aerospace to high-end manufacturing, rely heavily on complex global supply chains, often anchored in China. While France champions European strategic autonomy, its economic reality means its core sectors are vulnerable to geopolitical shocks, sanctions, or trade conflicts between major powers. The necessary global shift toward de-risking away from China presents an immense, costly challenge to French industry, which relies on the stability and accessibility of these global markets. A prolonged period of low domestic growth limits France's capacity to invest in the reshoring or diversification efforts necessary to achieve true autonomy. Finally, the accelerated loss of political and military influence in its historical sphere in Africa, particularly the Sahel region, carries deep financial risk. The instability and subsequent coups in former French colonies represent more than just a diplomatic setback. They challenge French economic access to vital resources, undermine the long-term stability of the CFA franc currency zone, and necessitate costly security deployments. The geopolitical recession mirrors the economic one, a powerful sign that France's strategic reach is shrinking as its financial resources dwindle. Future scenarios and the necessity of radical reform. Given the entrenched nature of France's structural problems, we must analyze the likely future pathways and the radical policy prescriptions required to avert the worst-case scenarios. The base case, Japanification and muddle-through. The most probable scenario is the continuation of the current muddle-through strategy, resulting in a state of Japanification. Under this trajectory, France avoids outright crisis, but settles into a pattern of persistent low growth, real GDP growth below 1% annually, high public spending sustained by historically low interest rates, and creeping public debt. Reforms will be incremental, generating significant social resistance, as seen with pension and unemployment changes, but insufficient to structurally change the economic model. The average French citizen's standard of living stagnates, translating into political polarization and a deepening societal malaise. While this path avoids an immediate catastrophe, it condemns France to long-term irrelevance compared to dynamic global economies. The negative scenario. The sovereign debt crisis trigger. The high-risk, high-impact scenario involves an exogenous shock that forces a sovereign debt crisis. This could be triggered by sustained global inflation, compelling the European Central Bank, ECB, to maintain interest rates significantly higher than current projections. The rising cost of servicing France's massive debt load, combined with a potential sovereign downgrade by major rating agencies, would trigger panic in the OAT market. A sharp, politically unacceptable divergence in French and German borrowing costs would materialize. The French government would be forced into sudden, deep, and politically violent austerity measures, mass civil service cuts, dramatic social program reductions, and tax hikes leading to widespread civil unrest, political chaos, and the potential rise of anti-establishment, potentially anti-EU, political parties. This scenario is the immediate threat to Eurozone integrity. The positive scenario. The unlikely structural revolution. The only path to genuine recovery requires a political consensus for radical, structural reform, far beyond anything attempted by President Macron. This would necessitate a comprehensive program focused on three pillars. First, structural fiscal consolidation. This requires a binding, multi-year commitment to reduce public spending by at least $5% of GDP, a reduction of over $150 billion per year through mass rationalization of the public sector, merging of state agencies, and restructuring of local government. This must be a spending cut, not just a tax increase. Second, aggressive supply-side reform. This means permanently lowering non-wage labor costs to align ULC with the Eurozone average, incentivizing corporate investment, and dramatically simplifying labor law. Simultaneously, strategic public investment should target new, competitive, future-oriented sectors like green technology, artificial intelligence, and cyber defense, leveraging France's nuclear base to provide the cheap, reliable power necessary to underpin this new industrial strategy. Third, societal contract renewal. The political class must articulate a compelling vision that trades current security for future prosperity, retraining the labor force for 21st-century jobs, and demonstrating that the pain of reform is necessary for generational wealth creation. This positive scenario is highly improbable given France's political culture and deep-seated resistance to change, but it represents the only viable route to restoring financial sovereignty and geopolitical leadership. Final synthesis. The core truth. The core truth of this analysis is that France's quiet economic decline has made it the Eurozone's most dangerous systemic vulnerability. Unlike the crises of the periphery, which were ring-fenced by the promise of German and ECB support, a French crisis would threaten the solvency of European banks, break the political and legal cohesion of the EU, and leave the continent strategically exposed. For the financial community, France is no longer an investment in growth, it is a complex hedge against political failure. Investment in French assets must be viewed through the lens of political stability and the likelihood of the ECB maintaining its protective role. The true opportunity is limited to globally successful, ring-fenced sectors, luxury, aerospace, and defense, which are independent of the sclerotic domestic economy. The silent erosion must stop being silent. It must be acknowledged as the existential threat it is. The time for incremental adjustment is over. The future of France, and indeed the future of Europe, hinges on whether the political elite can finally prioritize productive power over palliative spending. Without a structural revolution in finance and industry, the magnificent facade of France will continue to crumble, leaving behind an economic ruin that will destabilize the entire Western alliance. The ultimate warning for global finance is this: the Eurozone's ticking time bomb lies not on the periphery, but at its very core.